Good morning over here from Arizona. I'm back for, I think it is the fifth episode of our podcast. Today we got a little bit of interesting stuff. We're kind of leaving the Christian moral thought behind, and we're going to kind of go more into the logical, secularist kind of thought about morality. Like I said, there isn't quite as much to say about that, as it's a lot more simple. Since there's no moral obligations, it's somewhat more simple. Decisions would be made off of more like quantitative. I think that's the right word. Quantitative data. We're going to be looking at things like statistics. We're going to be looking at things like human flourishing or human well-being, and those would be the decisions. That would be the way that we would go about making our best decisions that's best for a population or best for people. You could use the utilitarian concept as well, to say that whatever is best for the greatest amount of people is what's best for society. And those are the means by which, as a secularist slash atheist, non-Christian thinker, that you would go about morality. There are a lot of people like Immanuel Kant, maybe Peter Singer, people who really go into how perhaps you can be socially moral, how you can live a moral life, what these guidelines might look like, how we can make sense of it, and how we can build a concrete foundation to appear the most moral that we can as a society. There's some stuff to say about that. Unless you guys have specific questions about that aspect of it, I don't have a lot to say about it. I'll probably just do a short video following up on this episode, just to kind of tune you guys in and make a concrete argument for why ration and logical thought is an effective means of getting good moral results. Something I also do want to mention is that today we are going into a little bit about children's moral obligations. At what age should children have moral obligations? These are my thoughts on these topics. I use a little bit of research from psychology, perhaps, to show as to why I think these ages are appropriate, as to why we expect children to have moral obligations at this age, or we don't expect them to. But these are my thoughts. That's the point of this podcast channel, is to share my thoughts, to get your thoughts. And pretty soon here, I'm still waiting for more followers to pick up, but we're going to go over the real mission statement. I'm going to kind of keep that clouded, but let me just tell you, we're going to practically build a society by the time that we're done within this year. We're going to build an ideal society, and after we build that ideal society and we all come to some kind of understanding through different polls that I will be taking, we're going to come to kind of understand what we think is right, what we think is normal, what is abnormal, what is natural, all those things. What is objective beauty? What is justice? Is morality better from the Christian thought, or is it better to keep morality, or is it better to keep the Christian thought out of morality, as it still wouldn't be objectively moral and it would just be according to God's will, and you wouldn't know God's will, so wouldn't you just be in the same boat as everybody else? But that's the other thing about the thought about the Christian thought on moral reasoning and morality and such, is that there is kind of a gray area when it comes to God's will. If you base evil and good, off of God's will, the problem that you run into with this is you have this kind of situation. Are you able to decipher God's will in its entirety? Surely no one is in a position to. All-knowing. What man do you know who can say he is all-knowing and all-powerful? How could we even begin to understand what a mind which has no material contents consists of? What is God's will then? Is it God's will that a man who lusts after a man can never participate in the institution of marriage? Think on these things. You have a situation where Christians are supposed to know God's will, And Christians are supposed to make the most moral decisions. But Christians aren't in a position to, in the entirety, know God's will. It's difficult to know what God is always willing, and I would argue that the Bible isn't a means of fully knowing God's will. So here's my thoughts on this. My thoughts on this are the decrees, the rules, the lessons that you learn in the Bible are things that are applicable. So you take something like, not having a divorce, or keeping the family unit intact, or not murdering, or not raping, and you take some of these morals and you think something to yourself like, so there is this situation in which I may have to lie. But if it's within God's will that I lie to protect myself, well, that makes perfect sense. What if it is the case, however, that so do you recall our situation with kind of hiding the Jews? It was just a hypothetical. What if you were in Nazi Germany, you hid the Jews, and you lied to the German authorities, and if we were just to take objective morality as in and of itself, no lying, then you would have to say that you sinned. And we're going to argue that that's not the case, because it wouldn't be God's will that you or the Jew you were hiding are sinners and should be condemned to hell. That's not at all what God is saying. But you do run into situations where you aren't too sure. You aren't too sure if the decision that you're making is actually moral or if it aligns with God's will. I will think of a good story I will tell on a short, so you can get a good idea of what one of these circumstances might kind of look like for you. Let's get into, though, the meat of this chapter, and we are talking about children, morality. If this kind of stuff offends you, it's a little bit dark. If this is something that's going to trigger you, I'll tell you now, it can be a little bit triggering. I'm gonna say some things that you're kind of like, whoa, like, whoa, that it's logical to me. Tell me if it's logical to you. Tell me your thoughts on this. But back to our foreign affairs and our domestic affairs. So we understand that from a secularist, atheist point of view, that you have social moral obligations. Society deems who has those social moral obligations. And adults, of course, have the most social moral obligation because they're the most cognitively developed. So we would expect that they would have the most burden for keeping society moral, keeping society good, and whatnot. That makes perfect sense. But what does that mean for people who are younger, for people who are less cognitively developed? Do they have some kind of moral obligation? Does a 16-year-old have a moral obligation? Does a 12-year-old have a moral obligation? Does a 8-year-old have a moral obligation? And finally, does a 3-year-old have some kind of moral obligation? So we logically think here that, well, it wouldn't be fair and it wouldn't be right to put some kind of burden of moral obligation on a 3-year-old when they're not cognitively developed as far as they would need to be to really make sense of the world and make sense of the obligations which you've given them. So we go further, and you still think, well, at 6 years old, they start to have a little bit more moral obligation on the scale. Well, let's just call it the scale of moral obligation. It goes to 10. So let's say the 3-year-old has really just probably 0.5 maybe moral obligations towards society that we expect the 3-year-old to uphold. The 6-year-old has just one as far as moral obligations to society goes, and a 10-year-old is going to have more like 5 or 6. Some of you are going to freak out and be like, why did it jump up so far for a 10-year-old? How is it that a 10-year-old who's not cognitively developed enough, we don't even try 10-year-olds in America anyways, as adults? I'm not sure if any country does, but yeah, just think about that for a second. There aren't a lot of countries that are going to try a 10-year-old as an adult for heinous crimes, but it's not as common. Well, in the United States, we got some random mass shootings going on with young kids or whatever. But look, typically, 10-year-olds aren't going around stabbing people, but they have the ability to. And they have the ability to reason it out. They actually have the ability to plan it out. 10-year-olds aren't just some innocent little beings walking around. Those suckers are just as evil as everybody else. They're just like less developed evil little people. That's kind of what we're looking at when we get to 10-year-olds. So we're going to give them a 5. And you guys can disagree with me on that number. Shoot down in my comments what number that you think a 5-year-old should have on the scale of moral obligations. That only goes to 10, by the way. Don't forget that. Okay, now we go to the 14-year-old. At 14 years old in America, we can try them as an adult for something like murder. I think even something like rape, we can try them as an adult. Okay, so at 14 years old, we've determined that they're cognitively developed enough to where we can put them in handcuffs, we can charge them as an adult, and they can spend, 15, 20 years in jail for a heinous crime. I'm not sure in America if they can get the death penalty at that age. It doesn't really matter because almost no one seems to get it. It seems to be just a stupid threat we do. You just stay on death row for 10 years and then you just hang out and eat free food. And anyways, death row's stupid, so who cares? Let's not talk about it, right? Okay, so we're going to give the 14-year-old a 7. Okay, that's only 2 points. That's only 2 points. Well, the thing is, there isn't as much difference between a 10 and a 14-year-old as you might want there to be. There really isn't. Not much. And that could depend on puberty. Puberty hits different children faster or slower, so it's really better that you assess each child to figure out what number that you should give them. They shouldn't just have this number on the obligation scale because of their age. They should have it because you assess what they can comprehend, what they can know, and what they can ascertain. Okay, now we move over to age 17. At age 17, we're going to give them on the moral obligation scale a 9. A 9. At this point, we expect them to make life-changing, life-altering decisions. Even though in the United States, they're not considered, an adult, they can't drink and whatever. But other countries with a little bit more, I would say, common sense, they're going to allow you to drink. They're going to allow you to do other things at 17. Well, they allow it at 16, but we're talking about a 17-year-old, but whatever. So we give this 17-year-old a 9. A 17-year-old has a high burden to carry as far as moral obligations go in society. Now let's just jump up, and we jump up to a 27-year-old. A 27-year-old for a male especially, but let's just say the same thing for a female, is going to be nearly fully cognitively developed. And we are going to give them the highest point. We're going to give them a 10. But here's the interesting thing. I think this 10 should start at 25. So 25 to the time you die, you have a 10-point burden to carry out goodness and to benefit society in the best way that you can. Okay? Now, some people are going to say, what happens when you turn 60? What happens when you're 75, when you're 80? Yeah, you can't do quite what you used to be able to do. You're not in the best shape. You're not cognitively there like you used to be or wanted to be. Fine. Perhaps they should have less moral obligation and less social burden to produce good and to benefit society. That's only fair because they're going to be cognitively declining. So that makes perfect sense that we're going to decrease the score as their cognitive abilities decrease. Now, here's the thing. Now, I hope you guys remember your homework. Your homework from last time was to start watching an anime show called Attack on Titan. You can watch this on Crunchyroll, and we are going to use that anime to talk about morality, both in the Christian thought and in the secularist thought, before we go to Israel in the Palestine conflict and we start talking a little bit more in depth about, which one is more moral. Or is it one? Or is it a culture? I'm going to argue it's a culture, but some people are going to say it's about the people. Whatever, people culture. I don't know. Whatever you want to call it. So tune in as soon as you can. Start watching the anime, the Attack on Titan, so you can kind of catch up, so you can follow the storyline. There's going to be a few different episodes. I'm thinking 3 or 4 different episodes on it as we talk about the issue. It's going to be a lot of fun, so make sure to do that homework so you can kind of understand what's happening. It does have 4 seasons, so I don't expect you to finish it all, but I don't want to spoil it for you if you had plans of watching Attack on Titan. But this storyline is so good, and there's such a huge disagreement on social media, especially Instagram, which is really where I see all the tea, whatever. Especially on Instagram, you're going to see so much of this, so much disagreement about who was right, who was wrong, who is moral, who wasn't. And in this anime, it has to do with genocide. So it is just too perfect of an opportunity to pass up to use an example as to who is right or who is moral, or what culture is superior or inferior, and what culture we want to support when it comes to the Palestine and Israel conflict. After that, of course, we're going to have to go into the conspiracy theories, because a lot of you are probably going to be upset at me, and you're going to say, oh, wow, whatever. But I don't want to tip my hand quite yet. You probably have some kind of good idea of who I support, but the reason might surprise you. I think the reason might surprise you. But we're going to have to talk about the conspiracy theories, so some of you can still hang around, figure out that I'm not just crazy here. I like evidence. I like to see the proof. I'm okay with hearing the conspiracy theories. I'm okay with reading about them. They sound cool. I'm always waiting for a conspiracy theory to drop. And then I'm always waiting for the truth to come out and have that conspiracy theory be right. That's the funnest stuff. But that doesn't mean you're going to tell me a conspiracy theory and I'm just going to believe it. I would like to see some evidence for it. I think that's fair. Don't you think that's fair? So what happens in wars between foreign nations is they have disagreements about what's moral. We have these things. We have this idea about war, like the Geneva Conventions, about how war should be fought, about what you can do, what you can't do. There are certain stipulations, certain rules that you should follow, and some people like these rules, and some people think that these things are fair, and we should follow them. Well, fair enough. Now, I do want to talk about. I talked to you so much about children's moral obligations, because here's a reality. The reality is, at 10 years old, maybe even a little bit before, a child is ready to pick up a gun, and a child is ready to kill you. A child is ready to have hate in their heart, and have a sense of wanting vengeance and reparations for perhaps what they went through. They can be vengeful. They're ready to kill you at 10. At 14, they're physically strong enough maybe to even take some of us in hand to hand. They're able to stab the crap out of us. They're able to shoot us in the head. They're able to verbalize their mission statements. They're able to be radicalized. And then at 18 years old, they're killing machines. They're killing machines. So they've already been programmed or brainwashed, whatever you want to call it. They're ready to kill. They know how to kill, and they are going to kill. Why is that? Well, that's what their society is about, right? It depends on what society, but let's say in this society, that's what it's about. That's what it's about. You got a mission. You got a goal. Your grandfather killed my grandfather. Your sister killed my aunt in the war 20 years ago. Therefore, I have to kill you. That's been my mission statement. That's been what I've understood since I was 10. Now I'm 18. I can really go out there and do it. I could have done it before, but now, I'm a real soldier. I'm physically really developed. I'm a fighting machine, and I'm going to kill you. So something else a lot of people disagree on is, at what age are children, really sexually mature? Now, this actually does matter at what age children are sexually mature and children are able to have intercourse, because children are. If you look at it historically, a lot of women were getting married away at 12 or 14 years old, and they were expected to birth as soon as their first period occurred. So women were considered historically sexually mature at 14 years old. They were prepared to carry out their motherly duties and their wife duties to their husband, or along with other women, depending on the status of the husband, I suppose. But today, that's frowned upon. Most people aren't fond of the idea of 20-year-olds marrying 14-year-olds, or 12-year-olds being married to 16-year-olds, or 18-year-olds. Most society isn't fond of that, and for good reason. We've used logic to deduce that that's not a great idea. We use statistics to see that, okay, maybe this is not a great idea. Maybe we should wait. And it's beneficial for society that this doesn't happen. Yet that doesn't change. However, society, just because society demands something or society has a different outlook, it doesn't change what's natural. The reality is 12-year-olds and 14-year-olds can and they will have intercourse. So 12 and 14-year-olds, sometimes even 10. I mean, sometimes 8. So some women can have the periods incredibly early, to where it's just crazy, to where maybe their bodies really aren't ready to reproduce in that sense, but they just happen to have a period because of some abnormal reason. I'm not too sure. But 14-year-olds back in the day, 12-year-olds back in the day, they could pop out babies no problem. They were doing it. They were doing it. That was their way of life. That's a reality that we have to face. Is that it is that from just a purely evolutionary stance of just raw logic and reason, it's natural, perfectly natural. Even though our society freaks out about it, about 12 and a 14-year-old or a 15 and a 13-year-old having intercourse, it's natural. It's natural. And people are going to say that a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old can't really, they can't consent. Now, legally, of course, they can't consent. And logically, that makes sense today that we would have that rule and that we have that law. But that's not natural. That's not a natural law. So I'm going to argue that when a woman is ready to reproduce, that she is able to make adult decisions. If you can have intercourse and you do have intercourse, then you are ready to make adult decisions. For men typically are going to be mature a little bit later. During puberty, they're going to hit the maturity. So something more like 13 or 14, 15 for young boys is when they're going to hit that sexual maturity. And that's when they're going to be able to reproduce with a woman. When a male has hit puberty and they have the capability of reproducing, we are going to consider them capable adults that should take certain moral obligations within a society, and they should face adult consequences. So practically what I'm saying is, we may say in America that we shouldn't try a kid as an adult until they're 14. I say make it when they're able to reproduce or they're sexually mature. That's when you should be able to be tried as an adult. You go with the biological flow with the body. That's how. For argument's sake and for simplicity, let us, however, say that 12-year-olds is the youngest for taking accountability. We'll cut everything off at 12. At 12 years old, you take adult accountabilities for anything that you might do. Now, there are some scenarios in which in these foreign affairs that children are puppets. Maybe they're brainwashed. Um, you know, this could absolutely happen if you're in a society that is a dictatorship, or that, like, I don't know, North Korea or something like that. I mean, you got to think those children are going to be brainwashed. Probably by the time of 12, they're ready to salute Kim Jong Un and they're ready to go to war for him. Like they probably got a picture up in their house of Kim Jong Un and they just love the guy. That's they're ready to kill probably at 12 in North Korea. I swear to God. Um, but anyhow, let's say here that 12 years old is our cutoff, and I'm going to argue here that kids are not so innocent, and kids at 12 and up need to take more accountability for their actions. It is the case in foreign wars and domestic wars that it's always the children that brings people to their knees. It's the death of young ones that really shake people up. You see the numbers about the casualties of adults, and that's those are the wages of war, right? Those are just things that you have to live with. Those are just things that you perhaps have to deal with. It doesn't seem to be something that you can get around. We have to suck it up and we have to move forward. But of course, some people still don't like it. It's not great when 1,000, 5,000, or 10,000 young men and some women are dying. It's not great. It's not ideal. And it's not something that most people wish. Some people do. Some people are like that. But most people are going to say that's not ideal. And that's not a world that we want to live in. That's not a fight that we want on our hands. And that's not something we want weighing on our consciousness. But it's even harder when it's the 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, all those ages. It's even harder when you think about the death tolls. And the reason it's harder is because we consider them to be innocent. We consider them to have less moral obligation. We consider some of them to not even be at the age of accountability to where they could have reasoned, to where they could have been a threat to you. They really truly are just innocent bystanders. And some of them at 4, 3, 2, they haven't even had a chance to be programmed by society. So they're not even in a position to where you can consider them a future threat at that present moment. Yet war is war, and those numbers are going to keep increasing as you see the amount of death, the death and the suffering for these children. So it's bothersome. But look here. Here's the logic here. There are consequences to failed cultures. There's consequences to inferior cultures. And there's consequences for every action that you take. If you just think that you're going to launch a missile and it's all going to be good, and there's Geneva Conventions, or they can't hit me as hard as I hit them, or they can't hit me that much harder, right? It has to be proportional. There's no freaking proportional. There's no such thing. Like what is this? Think back to gosh dang high school, like all the sports you did. Like I don't know, think about the groups in football or basketball or wrestling. You mess with the wrong guy, you got all uppity in his face. You punched him in the face, or you tried to choke him out or something. Then he ended up knocking your ass out. You're out cold, got bloody nose. I don't know, maybe he broke your arm, put you in an arm bar, and you're like, whoa, that wasn't proportional. Are you stupid? Of course, it's not gonna be freaking proportional. It's not as if you get to make stupid decisions and then you just sit there in shock when a stupid result occurs, right? That's kind of ridiculous. That's not natural. That's not how the real world works. You don't get to make decisions and then pick the consequences. The consequences are going to come to you. So before you make these stupid decisions, you got to think: am I in the position to take the consequence of these decisions? Am I going to be able to, if I walk up to a group of 10 guys and I punch one of them in the face because he kissed my girl yesterday, what's going to happen to me if I punch the one guy? What if all 10 of them jump in on me? And then I complain. I say I'm the victim. I was the victim. I punched him in the face, but he kissed my girl yesterday, and they all jumped me and beat the crap out of me. So now I'm just woe is me. What's wrong with you? What's wrong with people these days? You don't get to choose the consequences. You get to choose what decision you make at the present, and then you get to wait for the consequence. That's how it works. That's why you want to be in a good society that good standards, that have good morals, that have good ethics. That's why you want to be in successful cultures, cultures that help the population succeed and do well, cultures that provide for their citizens, cultures that have good military backing to be able to actually protect you. You want to be in a situation to where you're able to thrive. You got to be ready for all kinds of stuff. There are so many countries, I swear, so many people that are just sheep. They're just freaking sheep. They're really out here just bawing all over the place. Like, oh, whoa, what? This is reality. This is this is the real world here. People are gonna die. People are gonna be indoctrinated, and you're gonna have to make hard freaking decisions. I think it was just like President Truman did when he dropped that gosh dang atom bomb. A lot of people are gonna disagree with it. You know what? How many siblings would I sacrifice to save all those Japanese lives? I mean, think about it. How many? How many? You tell me a number. Comment down. Comment down there. How many of your family members would you sacrifice in a war versus Japan so you didn't have to drop the atom bomb? How many? I hate to say it, but I'm going to have to say zero. Yup, I'm going to have to say zero. I wouldn't sacrifice one of my family members for all the lives that were lost in Japan. And that's a hard reality pill a lot of people don't want to swallow. That's a hard reality pill that a lot of people can't take. Most people can't sit here and think, oh wow, yeah, oh, of course I'm gonna send out my sister and my. No, you aren't. No, you aren't. Most people these days are cowards. Most people don't do anything. Only very small percentage will ever serve in the military and actually have an opportunity to do something or serve in law enforcement. All those kind of dangerous jobs, only a small percentage of people actually do that. Most people just talk. Most people just talk. Most people sit here and say, oh, you know what? Look, all the children are suffering. Look how many people are dying. But then you ask them, hey, um, are you willing to give up your life to make sure that these children don't suffer and they don't die? Most people are going to say, oh, maybe. No, they aren't. No, they aren't. They really freaking aren't. Only a small percentage of society actually has any kind of willpower to actually get out there and do something. And I'm not going to lie. I'm a coward now. I'm not willing to get out there and do nothing. I like my cozy life. I like my warm bed. I love my wife and my kid. I don't want to leave this reality, man. This is hard, but man, beats being dead. Beats being dead. And I'm not gonna send my dad to die for none of you suckers, except for maybe a few of you neighbors. But for the most part, I'm not sending my dad out to die for no other country. Man, that's crazy to me. You might think, oh wow, this guy's just immoral. This guy's just immoral. I can't believe him. I mean, really take a look at yourself, though. Are you really any less of a coward? Have you really ever done something? Or do you just talk? And you're going to say, well, most people aren't in a position to do something. We're not in a position to. I couldn't have joined the army, or there's no volunteer force to go out, to go out and fight. Well, guess what? Guess what? All you suckers out there, you're the people who are voting in these legislators, senators, representatives, and judges, whatever. Depends on what state you're in. But you're voting in these people into power who have the same cowardice you do. So why do you think anything's going to change? Of course, you're not going to have the opportunity to volunteer on a mission. Of course, you're not going to be able to go out and serve justice and put your life at the front line just like that. I elaborate on this part. More so what I mean. But we are cowards, and we elect cowards. Therefore, we stay cowards. That's the reality. You're just gonna have to face it. You're probably a coward. I'm a coward. Let's be honest here. Let's be honest with ourselves. So you probably are. Now, a hard reality that we also have to accept is that the children of today may very well be the death of you in 10 years, or the enemy of you in 15, or maybe the cause of the death of your loved one in 20. You really never know. And that's another reason why we can't just be supporting these inferior cultures out here that promote genocide, or that promote dictatorships, or that promote misogyny in the real sense, not the liberal sense, but the real sense, misogyny. Like I'm talking like the way Iran treats people, kind of misogyny, that kind. I mean it. I'm serious. Kids are precious, but kids are a liability. They are. Kids are valuable, but they come with a heavy price to pay. Now think about back in those days when the Israelites went out to war, or just even other historical aspects. When they went and they conquered cities. Now notice how historically that they took over the cultures. They took over and they put their own rulers over those people. And sometimes they were able to integrate or merge cultures together to be able to create a superior culture. And then sometimes the culture and the people and their way of life was so strong that that they revolted and they were never going to merge into your culture. Some of those people got wiped off the face of the planet of the earth. That's what happened to inferior cultures. They got wiped off the face of the planet of the earth. Some of them. It's adapt and survive. That's what this world is. That's the reality. It's adapt and survive. Why are we still promoting such weakness? Why are we cheering for freaking inferior cultures that promise their people nothing, that abuse women, that promise children death? Why are we supporting these cultures? What reason? I see no reason. Understand that these children from these inferior cultures that brainwash them from the time that they're young, they're going to be your enemy. The likelihood that these children have some kind of shift in heart without some kind of practically a cultural insertion, and a cultural insertion is like one culture kind of infiltrating that culture, weaving its way through, setting new thoughts into their head, showing new ways of life. Without this kind of thing, these children will be your enemy. If their parents were your enemy, so will then to their children. That's likely the situation. And if their parents were unsuccessful and their parents created a pigsty and a mess and an inferior culture, they're probably going to create the same thing. These are cycles. These are toxic cycles. This is what happens in the world. You see this all the time. Look at these nations in Africa. They're inferior cultures, a lot of them. And they've stayed that way since the inception of America. And don't blame Americans for the world that the Africans live in. They're responsible for themselves. They could have been innovative. They could have been thoughtful. They could have used a better moral structure to improve their society, but they didn't. And guess who suffers every time a culture is inferior? Guess who suffers every time, people are weak? Children do. And then you put other people in a position to where they have to kill your children. And then guess what? When they have to kill your children, you're going to call them immoral. Even though you're no better. But you're going to call them immoral because they're superior to your culture. That's how the game works. That's how the game works. You create a trash culture You set your children up for failure. Your children do exactly what you taught them to do. And now when they're dying in masses, you're going to scream like you're the victim because you fought a superior culture. You sound freaking stupid. You sound weak. You sound like a sheep. That's no good. That's no good. Stop promoting sheepish behavior. Stop promoting weakness. This is we're going to be talking about this quite a bit. I know this is heavy, but I want you guys to understand how raw and real I want to be with you. These are the kind of talks we got to be having, these hard talks. We got to say these hard things that are hard to say without getting canceled. You know what I mean? I'm trying not to get canceled, but I don't think I went too far. I think this stuff is pretty fair. So these 10-year-olds, these 12-year-olds, these 14-year-olds, they're your future enemy. And it's a shame that they were raised the way they were in an inferior culture. Now the problem is, how do you change that? And then the other problem is, what can I do to avoid what's going to have to happen eventually to spare their lives? What can I do to avoid it? And then because of the inception of an inferior culture, you're going to end up actually killing some of those children who don't need to be your enemy tomorrow because they aren't brainwashed enough yet. They're at the age of no accountability. They can't be accountable for anything. But you're still in a position where you have to kill them. Now that's on your consciousness. But you got to ask yourself, why isn't that on the consciousness of the inferior culture? Why aren't we blaming inferior cultures for the death tolls of the children that they brainwashed? Why aren't we blaming them? You don't blame the strong. You blame the freaking weak. You blame the weak. Now that's something that I wanted to say. It is not the strong only that has the moral obligations to do good and to preserve peace. It is also the moral obligation of the weak. And guess what? The strong do not have more moral obligation to a society than the weak. Guess what? The rich do not have more of a moral obligation to society than the poor. My thought is that moral obligation is a flat line that goes all the way across. It's just flat. It stays stagnant. And everyone needs to uphold that standard. Weak, strong, poor, rich. Stop being a freaking victim. You're more than just that. And stop promoting weak cultures.